Hey everyone, welcome back to World War II History Retold. In today's episode, we're heading into the pitch-black waters of the Solomon Islands, where a handful of American destroyers prepared a trap so perfect that even the Japanese called it a masterpiece. Radar, timing, and sheer nerve all came together in one explosive moment. Get ready, because this is a story you won't forget. Let's dive right in. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy ran aggressive nocturnal supply missions down the slot of the Solomon Islands, runs the Allies nicknamed the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers would ferry troops and supplies to beleaguered garrisons under cover of darkness, exploiting Japan's reputed superiority in night fighting. These Tokyo Express missions repeatedly slipped past or mauled Allied naval forces. On the night of August 9, 1942, for example, a powerful Allied cruiser force was ambushed and annihilated in the Battle of Savo Island, with 4 cruisers sunk in under an hour. In subsequent battles, Cape Esperance, the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Tassafaronga, Japanese night torpedo attacks devastated U.S. ships. The U.S. Navy learned bitter lessons. By mid-1943, it had lost nearly every night surface engagement in the Solomons campaign, suffering thousands of casualties. American warships had radar, but radar alone did not win battles when doctrine and training lagged behind. One major culprit was the early model SC air search radar. Operating at a 1.5-meter wavelength, SC sets could detect large ships out to about 20,000 yards, but with very poor resolution. Around complex shorelines, SC radar returns blurred together with land echoes. Operators saw only an undifferentiated jumble on their scopes. During the Battle of Savo Island, U.S. ships actually picked up Japanese vessels on SC radar, but the contacts were misinterpreted as land. Lookouts still had to visually confirm targets before opening fire. Time and again, this delay proved fatal. Japanese lookouts, superbly trained for night work, would spot Allied ships first. Then the Japanese would unleash their Type 93 long lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled weapons with an astonishing 40,000-yard range, roughly double that of the U.S. Navy's Mark 15 torpedoes. In battles like Tassafaronga, November 30, 1942, Japanese destroyers fired long-range salvos and withdrew before American ships even realized they were under attack. U.S. commanders, still reliant on eyesight and cautious about unconfirmed radar blips, were repeatedly caught off guard. By mid-1943, however, the U.S. Navy was fielding a new secret weapon that promised to change the equation, the SG surface search radar. Developed in 1941 at the MIT Radiation Laboratory using the British cavity magnetron, the SG was a 10-centimeter wavelength microwave radar, far shorter wavelength than SC, giving it dramatically improved resolution. It was the Navy's first radar with a plan. Position indicator, PPI display, showing contacts on a circular screen with range and bearing, essentially the prototype of modern radar scopes. Crucially, the SG could distinguish ships from land masses, piercing the maze of island reflections that had confounded older sets. The first operational SG radar went aboard USS Augusta in April 1942, and by mid-1943, SG sets were being installed on most U.S. cruisers and destroyers in the Pacific. Technically, the Americans now had the tools to detect and track enemy ships in total darkness at long range. But technology alone wasn't enough. Success would require new tactics and a willingness to trust the radar. SG radar and new destroyer tactics. American naval doctrine in early 1943 still treated radar as an adjunct to traditional methods. Night task forces were built around cruisers for gunnery power, with destroyers as escorts. Standing orders were to hold fire until you could see the enemy, or at least a radar contact could be confirmed visually. U.S. commanders simply did not yet fully trust radar-only targeting, a hesitation Japanese veteran crews exploited with deadly effect. But a few bold officers began to challenge this orthodoxy. One was Commander Arleigh Burke, skipper of Destroyer Squadron 23, the Little Beavers. Burke had studied the Solomons battles and became convinced that American destroyers, using their new radars aggressively, could beat the Tokyo Express at its own game. He drilled his destroyermen in radar-guided torpedo attacks, detect the enemy on radar beyond visual range, close in unseen, fire torpedoes based on radar solutions without revealing yourself, and only then open up with gunfire once the fish are in the water. Burke's tactics were revolutionary and met resistance from traditionalists, but they worked. In early July 1943, Burke's squadron successfully ambushed a Japanese force in the Battle of Kolombangara, and his ideas were gaining credence. Senior commanders in the South Pacific began to take note. Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, in charge of amphibious forces, was one of those convinced by the recent successes. In early August 1943, Allied intelligence learned that the Japanese were preparing yet another Tokyo Express run to reinforce their garrison at Vila on Kolombangara Island. The Japanese had just lost the airfield at Munda, New Georgia, on August 5th, and Vila, on Kolombangara's southern tip, was now critical to their defense line. 3 Tokyo Express runs to Vila had succeeded in the prior weeks, the 19th July, the 29th July, and the 1st August 1943. During the last of those, American PT boats attempted an ambush. The attack failed, and in the confusion, PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, was run down and sunk by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri. Determined to stop the next convoy, Wilkinson decided to try a new approach: send a force comprised solely of radar-equipped destroyers, with no cruisers to hold them back. He gave command to Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, a destroyer division leader who had served under Arleigh Burke and embraced the new tactics. Even more astonishing, Wilkinson explicitly told Moosbrugger he had freedom to ignore the usual tactical advice from higher headquarters. In fact, Wilkinson's staff had recommended avoiding torpedo attacks and relying on long-range gunnery, advice Moosbrugger knew was antiquated. Moosbrugger confidently replied that his destroyers would utilize their primary weapon, torpedoes, in the coming battle, guided by radar as needed. Moosbrugger convened all 6 of his destroyer skippers for a final briefing before getting underway on August 6th. The plan they crafted drew directly on Burke's doctrines and their own hard-earned lessons. The task group, designated Task Group 31.2, comprised 6 destroyers: USS Dunlap, DD-384, USS Craven, DD-382, USS Maury, DD-401, USS Lang, DD-399, USS Sterett, DD-407, and USS Stack, DD-406. Moosbrugger divided them into 2 3-ship divisions. Destroyer Division 12, his division A-1, included Dunlap, his flagship, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Clifton Iverson, Craven, and Maury, all of which still carried their full pre-war outfit of torpedo tubes. This division would execute a stealthy torpedo attack. Destroyer Division 15, Division A-2, under Commander Roger Simpson, consisted of Lang, Sterett, Lieutenant Commander Frank G. Gould, and Stack, ships that had landed some torpedo tubes in exchange for extra anti-aircraft guns. A-2 would provide covering fire with guns after the torpedoes hit, and position itself to cross the T of the enemy, that is, to rake the Japanese column from a perpendicular angle. Radio silence would be maintained, and there would be no star shells, no searchlights, and no premature gunfire to give them away. Trust the radar, Moosbrugger urged his captains. Every ship's Combat Information Center, CIC, the new radar plotting room, would be key. The CIC teams had to track the enemy on their SG scopes, share target data, and calculate torpedo solutions in perfect sync across all 6 ships. The plan was daring, even risky. It put faith in new technology and tactics that had never been used by U.S. destroyers operating alone. But if it worked, it could catch the enemy completely by surprise. Setting the trap in Vella Gulf. On the evening of August 6, 1943, Moosbrugger's Task Group 31.2 slipped out of Purvis Bay, near Guadalcanal, and steered toward Vella Gulf, a body of water bounded by Kolombangara Island to the east and Vella Lavella Island to the west. The American crews were well aware of the significance of their mission. Morale was high, knowing they finally had free rein to fight their destroyers as they saw fit. The night was moonless and overcast, with visibility under 1,000 yards, ideal conditions for radar and terrible for eyeballs. Around 2300 hours, 11 p.m., the U.S. destroyers entered Vella Gulf from the south at 25 knots. Moosbrugger deployed them in two parallel columns about 500 yards apart, Division A1 to port, left, and Division A2 to starboard, right. They hugged the dark coastline of Kolombangangara to their east as they advanced. All 6 ships' SG radars were actively sweeping the Gulf ahead and around them. The scopes showed the nearby land masses clearly, Kolombangara looming to the right, Vella Vella to the left, and empty black water in between. Each CIC team intently watched for any pip or blip that might reveal the approaching enemy. They did not have to wait long. At 23:33, USS Dunlap's radar picked up the telltale echoes of multiple ships to the northwest. 4 contacts in column formation, bearing 312 degrees true at a range of about 29,500 yards. The radar pips were faint but clean against the background, exactly where Intel had predicted the Japanese would be. Within seconds, Craven and Maury also acquired the targets on their screens, confirming the contact. Moosbrugger's quarry had arrived right on schedule. It was indeed the Japanese reinforcement group. 4 destroyers under Captain Kaju Sugiura, commander of Destroyer Division 4. Sugiura's force comprised the Kagero-class destroyers Hagikaze, his flagship, and Arashi, and the Shiratsuyu-class destroyers Kawakaze and Shigure. 2 of the Japanese ships, Hagikaze and Arashi, were laden with some 900 troops and supplies bound for Kolombangara. 1, Kawakaze, carried additional soldiers. The last, Shigure, had no troops aboard and served as a rearguard escort. Commander Tameichi Hara, an experienced tactician and author of Japanese destroyer captain, commanded Shigure at the tail of the column. Earlier that day at Rabaul, Hara had protested Sugiura's plan of using the same approach route through Vella Gulf that the Tokyo Express had already used 3 times. Repeating a route is inviting disaster, he warned, but Captain Sugiura overruled him. The Japanese were confident. Their nocturnal prowess had kept the Tokyo Express viable for months, and they had no inkling that an American destroyer squadron lay in wait that very night. Stealth was now the Americans' greatest asset. Remarkably, Sugiura's ships were sailing forward without any radar assistance. In mid-1943, most Japanese destroyers still lacked radar, or had only very crude sets. In Shigure's case, Commander Hara later confirmed that none of the 4 Vella Gulf destroyers had working radar that night. They relied entirely on their lookouts and the cover of darkness. And darkness there was. Kolombangara's 5,000-foot mountains were now between the Japanese and the moon's faint glow, casting a vast shadow. The American destroyers, hugging Kolombangara's shoreline, were effectively invisible in that deep gloom. Meanwhile, their SG sets could see the Japanese clearly at 15 nautical miles. Moosbrugger realized they had achieved complete surprise. Now he moved to capitalize on it. At around 2340, with the range closing toward 15,000 yards, he ordered Division A1 to accelerate and maneuver into firing position for a torpedo attack. Iverson, aboard Dunlap, at the head of A1, adjusted course to swing out a bit from the island's shadow, while Division A2, under Simpson, slowed slightly to stay astern and to starboard, covering the northern flank. The American ships were effectively dividing the enemy's attention. Moosbrugger's 3 ships moving into the Japanese column's left, port flank, Simpson's 3 shifting out to the right, starboard, front, ready to cross their T from ahead. Within Shigure, Commander Hara was feeling uneasy. His ship had been lagging about 1,000 meters behind the preceding destroyer due to engine trouble maintaining speed. When his navigator asked if they should use an emergency engine overboost to catch up, Hara curiously replied, "No, this is good enough. To hell with that 500 meters. Don't overboost the engine." Perhaps Hara sensed a trap. He later admitted he had a premonition of danger that night. He ordered Shigure's crew to general quarters and guns trained to the left, port, the direction from which he felt the greatest threat might emerge. At that very moment, aboard the U.S. ships, Moosbrugger had given the final order. Stand by to fire torpedoes. It was now 23:41. The range had closed to about 7,500 yards, point-blank range for the Americans' Mark 15 torpedoes. In the CICs, target solution data, enemy course, speed, range, had been plotted and fed to the torpedo data computers. The American destroyers, still undetected, were in an optimal attack position off the Japanese port flank, matching course southward. In quick succession, Dunlap, Craven, and Maury loosed their torpedoes. A full spread of 24 Mark 15 torpedoes, 8 from each ship, churned out into the darkness in the space of just 63 seconds. The launches were entirely unseen and unheard by the enemy. The tin fish were water tracks invisible in the night. As soon as their torpedoes were away, Moosbrugger's 3 ships peeled off hard to starboard, right, at flank speed, darting back behind the cover of Kolombangara's shoreline from which they had emerged. Division A-1 effectively vanished back into the island's shadow, the U.S. torpedoes now racing northwest toward the unsuspecting Japanese formation at 46 knots. By calculation, they would hit in about 4 minutes. The trap had been sprung. The ambush unfolds, torpedoes and shellfire. For several tense minutes, the drama played out in eerie silence. The Japanese destroyers steamed ahead at about 30 knots, oblivious to the danger streaking toward them beneath the waves. On Shigure, Commander Hara's crew strained to peer into the murk. Hara's instincts were on edge. He later wrote that he suspected something was amiss, given the oppressive darkness and the fact that this run had been too uneventful. Suddenly a cry rang out on Shigure's bridge. "White waves! Black objects! Several ships heading toward us!" a lookout shouted. It was too late. At 23:46, Moosbrugger's torpedoes hit their marks with devastating effect. A series of heavy explosions ripped through the Japanese column as torpedoes slammed home almost simultaneously. Hagikaze, the lead destroyer, was struck by 2 torpedoes. One hit detonated her forward magazine in a massive fireball. Another smashed her engineering spaces, snuffing out power. Arashi, following second in line, was also hit by at least 2 torpedoes and engulfed in flames, dead in the water. Kawakaze, third in line, took a catastrophic torpedo blow directly under her bridge, likely in a main magazine, and literally exploded, breaking apart and sinking within minutes. The 4th destroyer, Shigure, by fortune or fate, had been trailing a bit behind, and that saved her from immediate destruction. At least one torpedo streaked toward Shigure and actually passed right through her stern, punching a 2-foot hole in her rudder without exploding. A dud. Shigure veered wildly, her steering damaged, but she was still afloat and under her crew's control. In those first moments, 3 of Captain Sugiura's 4 ships had been crippled in one blow. It was as if hell itself had opened, one American sailor later recalled, of seeing the distant orange fireballs blossoming in the night. Even as the torpedoes struck, Moosbrugger's Division A-2 was moving in for the kill. Commander Simpson's 3 destroyers, Lang, Sterrett, and Stack, which had been holding fire to avoid giving away the ambush, now opened up with their 5-inch guns the instant they observed explosions on the enemy. They had executed their part of the plan perfectly, crossing the T of the Japanese. The 3 U.S. ships were arrayed perpendicular to the head of the Japanese column, able to train all their guns broadside, while the stricken enemy could only reply, if at all, with the few forward mounts that still worked. The Americans' first salvos found their mark amid the infernos consuming Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze. Within moments, additional secondary blasts were erupting from those ships as fuel and ammunition caught fire. A Japanese officer on Shigure described the scene as chaos. The sea around them was illuminated by towering pillars of fire and the strobing flashes of American naval gunfire. Dazed survivors on Hagikaze and Arashi who hadn't been killed instantly were now being scythed down by shell splashes. One by one, the 3 Japanese destroyers began to slip under the waves. Only Shigure remained, and Commander Hara wasted no time trying to retaliate. As soon as he grasped that they were under attack by surface ships, an attack delivered with uncanny precision and no warning, he ordered Shigure's torpedoes fired in the direction of the muzzle flashes now visible to starboard. Shigure spewed out 8 Type 93 torpedoes into the darkness towards the gun flashes of Division A-2. Luck, however, was not with the Japanese that night. All of Hara's frantic torpedo shots missed their targets. The American destroyers had already begun twisting evasively, having anticipated a desperate Japanese riposte. With his comrades' ships now sinking and no hits scored, Hara made the only sensible decision: escape. Shigure, still making speed despite her mangled rudder, popped a smokescreen, ceased fire, and sheered off to the northwest at flank speed. By midnight, the Battle of Vella Gulf was effectively over. Moosbrugger's destroyers regrouped and cautiously swept the area with radar for any remaining contacts. Aside from the dying echoes of the 3 crippled ships, there was no sign of the 4th enemy. Shigure had slipped away into the night, the sole survivor of Sugiura's squadron. A perfect American victory. In just 26 minutes, from first radar contact at 23:33 to the last explosions around 23:59, the U.S. Navy had won one of the most lopsided naval victories of World War II. All 3 targeted Japanese destroyers were sunk, and the 4th badly damaged and in flight. Japanese casualties were appalling. Roughly 1,210 Japanese sailors and soldiers were lost, most of them drowning after the ships went down. About 300 survivors managed to swim or float to nearby Vella Island, from where they were later evacuated. Captain Sugiura, commander of the Tokyo Express Force, survived the sinking of Hagikaze and was among those rescued, only to face sharp censure for the debacle. By contrast, American losses were essentially zero. Not a single U.S. ship was hit or even seriously fired upon during the engagement. Only 1 American sailor was injured. A crewman on Dunlap suffered a crushed hand in an unrelated accident during the battle. One U.S. officer later quipped that the only American loss was a cheese sandwich. He had been eating a midnight snack when the shooting started and flung his sandwich overboard as he ran to his battle station. Rear Admiral Wilkinson's bold experiment, unleashing radar-equipped destroyers to act on their own, had proven an overwhelming success. It was the first time in the Pacific War that U.S. destroyers, without any cruiser support, had independently engaged and defeated an equivalent Japanese force at night. The victory at Vella Gulf marked a turning point in the Solomons naval campaign. As historian Samuel Morrison later noted, this battle was the first in which the Japanese had been beaten in a night destroyer action in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, lauded the engagement as a little classic of naval warfare, a textbook example of a perfectly executed ambush. In a span of minutes, the 6 American tin cans had accomplished what dozens of PT boats and many larger warships had failed to do for months: halt the Tokyo Express cold. With 3 destroyers gone and Shigure damaged, the Imperial Navy could no longer use destroyers to supply Kolombangara. In fact, the Allies never needed to capture Kolombangara at all. The Japanese garrison there was cut off and withered on the vine, as Allied forces simply bypassed it and landed on Vella instead on August 15. By early October, the Japanese completely abandoned Kolombangara. Vella Gulf had effectively severed the Tokyo Express line in the Central Solomons. Moosbrugger's after-action report credited much of this unprecedented victory to the new radar and tactics. The new SG radar made the success of this operation possible, he wrote in summary, noting that his destroyers had been able to track the enemy continuously from long range, maneuver optimally, and strike first, all without being detected. He also praised the performance of the ship's Combat Information Centers, CICs, and radar plotters, whose precise tracking and communication ensured that the entire task group was firing at the right place at the right time. Indeed, the coordination was remarkable. 3 ships, blinded by darkness, launching 24 torpedoes almost simultaneously at unseen targets, and scoring 1/3 hits. Japanese Commander Hara, writing after the war, expressed both astonishment and admiration. The hits on Arashi and Kawakaze were phenomenal, Hara noted, calling Vella Gulf a perfect American victory. Never before had I seen such marksmanship by the enemy, he admitted. From the Japanese side, it truly had been an ambush out of nowhere. Hara initially thought perhaps submarines or even coastal artillery must have been involved, as it seemed impossible that surface warships had crept so close without detection. In his official report filed at Rabaul, Hara described the encounter simply as an ambush by unknown forces that delivered devastating torpedo blows with no warning. The concept that 6 U.S. destroyers had stalked his ships by radar from beyond visual range and coordinated a perfectly timed torpedo attack was outside the framework of what Japanese commanders then believed possible. The U.S. Navy, for its part, wasted no time in recognizing the heroes of Vella Gulf, at least those at the command level. Admiral William F. Halsey, South Pacific Force Commander, presented Navy crosses to Commander Frederick Moosbrugger and 2 of his destroyer captains, Lieutenant Commander Clifton Iverson, Dunlap, and Lieutenant Commander Frank Gould, Sterrett, for their leadership and gallantry in the battle. Even Moosbrugger's fellow tactician Arleigh Burke sent a personal congratulations. Burke wrote to him, "Dear Moose, your battle the other night will go down in history as one of the most successful actions ever fought. It was splendidly conceived and marvelously executed." And indeed, it did go down in history. Moosbrugger's triumph set a new standard for night combat. On November 25, 1943, Burke himself emulated the feat in the Battle of Cape St. George, using similar radar night tactics to intercept a Japanese destroyer force off New Ireland. Burke's squadron sank 3 out of 5 enemy destroyers with no losses in what was essentially a Vella Gulf replay. The tide had turned. Radar had swung the advantage in the nighttime naval war. Aftermath, changing the course of the Pacific War. The Battle of Vella Gulf sent shockwaves through both navies. The U.S. Navy immediately circulated Moosbrugger's action report to commanders throughout the Pacific. The message was clear. Properly employed, SG radar and aggressive tactics could decisively win night engagements. No longer would destroyers hang back as mere escorts for bigger ships. They could be hunters in their own right. Within days, other destroyer flotillas in the Solomons began to copy the formula. In mid-August 1943, American destroyers fought a skirmish off Horaniu, Vella Vella, and successfully turned back another Tokyo Express run, using radar to navigate and avoid a Japanese trap. On August 17, 1943, just 11 days after Vella Gulf, a U.S. destroyer force intercepted an enemy group near Bougainville and sank 2 Japanese destroyers with minimal damage to themselves. The kill ratio had flipped. Now it was the Japanese who were losing ships without reply. The ultimate validation came on November 25, 1943, at Cape St. George, as mentioned, when Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 ambushed a withdrawing Japanese force and sank 3 destroyers, including Sugiura's former ship Onami, for no American losses. These consecutive victories effectively ended Japanese destroyer transport missions in the Solomon Islands. By late September 1943, the Imperial Navy had grudgingly changed its doctrine. Destroyers were thenceforth to avoid night surface combat, unless in overwhelming strength. The Tokyo Express supply runs dwindled. The Japanese increasingly resorted to using submarines or small barges to supply outposts, methods that were slower and ultimately insufficient. The U.S. Navy's destroyer force, once outclassed in night fighting, had become the masters of nocturnal warfare. From a broader perspective, Vella Gulf and the battles that followed were manifestations of a larger shift, the integration of new technology with new doctrine. The advantage the Japanese had enjoyed in 1942, superior torpedoes, superb night optics, well-trained crews, was now countered by American electronics and innovation. Notably, by mid-1943, the U.S. Navy had finally corrected the many defects of its own torpedoes. Less than 2 weeks before Vella Gulf, Admiral King ordered the deactivation of the faulty magnetic exploders on U.S. torpedoes, meaning the Mark 15s now relied on contact fuses and would detonate reliably on impact. This fix paid off handsomely. Every American torpedo that hit a target at Vella Gulf exploded except one, the dud that passed through, Shigure's rudder. American torpedoes, once derided as duds or fish without teeth, were finally biting, and U.S. destroyer crews were eager to use them. Japanese naval intelligence, in analyzing debacles like Vella Gulf, came to a belated realization that U.S. radar capability had leapt ahead. They examined captured Allied radars and knew of the SG microwave sets, which in theory were not very different from their own nascent radar. But the key difference was how they were used. Japanese doctrine still placed primary faith in the human eye. Radar contacts were often doubted or ignored until verified by lookouts. The Americans, after Vella Gulf, flipped that thinking. Radar became the primary source of targeting information, and visual sighting became secondary. This doctrinal shift, treating radar as true eyes in the dark, was arguably more important than the hardware itself. In a way, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced an enemy that now fought the way they had in 1942, striking first from the shadows. Japanese reports began to note that American ships seemed to know their positions before they were sighted. The conclusion was inescapable. Without some countermeasure to Allied radar, which Japan never effectively developed during the war, surface combat in darkness had become a losing proposition. Legacy of Vella Gulf and the Radar Revolution. The impact of the Vella Gulf action resonated far beyond the Solomons. By 1944, the U.S. Navy routinely employed radar-directed tactics in night battles across the Pacific. Destroyers and even big gunships like battleships used radar fire control to lethal effect. A direct descendant of Moosbrugger's tactics can be seen in the Battle of Surigao Strait, October 25, 1944, part of the Battle of Vella Gulf, when Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's force, including many destroyers, ambushed a Japanese battleship group at night. There, U.S. destroyers launched over 24 torpedoes guided by radar bearings, contributing to the sinking of the Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once dominant at night, was by 1944 outclassed and virtually paralyzed after dark. By early 1945, Japanese surface forces generally avoided night engagements altogether, ceding the night seas to the Allies. Meanwhile, the technical marvel that made this change possible, the SG radar, quietly proved its worth through the end of World War II. Nearly 1,000 SG radar units were built during the war. They were installed not only on destroyers and cruisers, but on battleships, carriers, and even submarines. These sets remained in frontline service into the late 1940s, about 2 decades in some capacity, until post-war advances produced newer, better radars. By the 1950s, the SG, once cutting edge, was obsolete, superseded by even shorter wavelength radars with greater range and clarity. As ships modernized or were decommissioned, the old SG sets were removed. Unfortunately, very few examples were preserved. The technology had been top secret, and once it was outdated, it seems most were scrapped or relegated to training schools. Today, one can find perhaps an antenna here or a console there in museum storage, but no complete SG radar is on public display. It's an odd historical footnote that the humble device which helped win so many night battles remains largely invisible to the public. The human element of Vella Gulf's legacy is just as significant. The battle demonstrated the value of a well-trained, well-coordinated team behind the technology. Each destroyer's CIC, the radar operators, plotters, communications ratings, had performed flawlessly under pressure, contributing as much to the victory as those manning the guns or torpedo tubes. However, due to wartime secrecy, these contributions went largely unheralded at the time. Radar capabilities were highly classified, so official accounts and press releases could not openly credit the technology or its operators. Instead, public statements attributed the victory to superior tactics, training, and valor, which was true, but not the whole story. The Navy was happy to celebrate Moosbrugger and his ship captains. Rightfully so, their leadership was brilliant. But the individual radar men and technicians remained unsung heroes. Even in post-war histories, detailed acknowledgement of the radar teams was sparse. Vice Admiral Frederick Moosbrugger never forgot their importance. In later years, as he rose through the ranks, he retired as a vice admiral in 1956, Moosbrugger made a point of educating young officers about valuing their technical experts. He often used the Vella Gulf example in talks, emphasizing that the enlisted radar operators and technicians had understood their equipment's potential even before some officers did, and that the victory was possible because those sailors performed their jobs perfectly. He noted how the torpedo fire control parties had to trust completely in data from the CIC, firing torpedoes at targets they could not see, and they did so with absolute precision. Moosbrugger would say that a good commander must listen to and trust his enlisted specialists, for they are the ones who make the complex machinery of war actually work. Indeed, Moosbrugger's own willingness to trust his radar teams and to defy conventional doctrine was a major factor in the success at Vella Gulf. For his leadership that night, Moosbrugger earned a revered place in destroyer history. The U.S. Navy even named a destroyer after him, USS Moosbrugger, DD-980, commissioned in 1978 in his honor. What of the Japanese perspectives after the battle? Commander Tamechi Hara, who survived the war, wrote a candid memoir in which he acknowledged that Vella Gulf was a shocking defeat. He termed it a perfect American victory and squarely admitted that radar had tipped the scales. Japanese lookouts and brave, seamanship simply could not overcome an enemy that could see first in the dark. Hara's beloved Shigure managed to survive Vella Gulf, only to meet its end in January 1945, when the U.S. submarine USS Blackfin torpedoed and sank her in the Gulf of Siam. Captain Kaju Sugiura, the unfortunate commander at Vella Gulf, was given another command later in the war, the heavy cruiser Haguro. In May 1945, fate caught up with Sugiura in grimly poetic fashion. The Royal Navy dispatched a destroyer flotilla to hunt down Haguro in the Malacca Strait. On the night of May 16, 1945, they caught Sugiura's cruiser and her escorting destroyer using radar in a planned night ambush strikingly similar to Moosbrugger's tactic. The British destroyers made radar contact at long range, encircled the target in darkness, and launched waves of torpedoes. Haguro was hit repeatedly and sunk. Captain Sugiura went down with his ship. It was the final act in a chain of events that began at Vella Gulf. The same methods that sank Sugiura's destroyers in 1943 were used to destroy his cruiser in 1945. As one Royal Navy officer put it, "We arranged ourselves in a crescent cordon and allowed the Japanese to sail into the trap." The age of radar-dominant naval warfare had truly arrived, and there was no escaping it, even for the most seasoned veterans of the old school. In the annals of World War II, the Battle of Vella Gulf may not be as famous as Midway or Leyte Gulf, but its significance is profound. It was a triumph of innovation, the moment when new technology, new tactics, and skilled people all came together to overturn conventional wisdom. Radar did not single-handedly win the battle. It was radar in the hands of those who knew how to use it that made the difference. The U.S. Navy learned and adapted, painfully at first, but with spectacular results once the lessons were applied. Vella Gulf's success paved the way for all the radar-guided victories to come. As we reflect on that deadly 23 minutes of chaos in the darkness, we see how a handful of daring commanders and their crews changed the trajectory of naval warfare. They proved that with the right tools and the courage to trust them, even the darkest night could be turned into an ally. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.